When William Shakespeare put feather quill to parchment back in the 16th century, he could never have guessed how poignant his views on an island nation would prove to be, as war ravaged the world in the first half of the 20th century. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. In fact, it was Great Britain, and not just England, in the firing line, and every man, woman and child discovered what it was to be a nation at war when Adolf Hitler and the German army marched into Poland and refused to leave. The year was 1939, and the storm clouds of conflict had been gathering for some time. Right from the start, there was a resilience and determination reminiscent of William Shakespeare's fine sentiments deep within the hearts of the people of Britain, and they rallied to the great bard's war cry, ready to defend with their lives the country that they held most dear. The odds may have seemed stacked against the British Isles, and there were dark days when the Silver Sea ran red with the blood of its young fighting men. But it has nevertheless been argued that this was Britain's finest hour. A community spirit developed during the war years and in the immediate aftermath that was irrepressible, and this programme is a celebration of that very spirit and national pride, whilst commemorating all of those who lost their lives fighting not only for king and country, but also for the freedom of the world. The dictionary defines history as a record or account of past events, but unfortunately, in the instance of war, things are never quite so simple or straightforward. The history of war is in most cases recorded by the victors, so even accepted facts, dates and statistics can fail to present a true and accurate record of what really happened. Fortunately, in the case of World War II, there are still people who can recount their memories firsthand, and although their numbers are decreasing as time goes by, at least there are film archives and recordings to preserve the unadulterated story of a war that shaped the world in which we all now live. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was hailed as the war to end all wars. More than 10 million men lost their lives in the trenches, and at least another 20 million were wounded. The scale of destruction was unparalleled, and when armistice finally came, the political map of Europe was completely redrawn. The victorious Allied powers, with France and Britain at the forefront, sought retribution, and Germany was forced to accept sole war guilt. Valuable industrial land was stripped from the Germans, and a huge demand for financial compensation left them with a colossal war debt. In addition, complete disarmament, the abolition of all forms of military service, and the destruction of armament factories were mandatory. For the Allied powers, such draconian measures seemed perfectly justified, but it was a recipe for disaster. The German nation could not pay its war debt, or even feed its people. By the 1920s, the unit of currency, the mark, had crashed as hunger riots spread across the land. Worse still was to come, and by the early 1930s, 9 million people were unemployed, and those in work had their wages cut by half. It was against this background that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power. The times were desperate, and a man who, in the normal order of any society, would have been dismissed as a dangerous fanatic, became Germany's leader. Targeting the Jews as scapegoats for Germany's financial woes, Hitler fostered a sense of much longed-for national pride with flag-waving, uniforms, parades and military rallies. The unemployed were drafted into Hitler's vast armament factories, growing armies and the secret police. Opposition to his stormtrooping tactics was brutally crushed, and the rest of Europe was thrown into turmoil. Austria was seized by Hitler, Czechoslovakia was targeted next, and with war very definitely on the horizon, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet Adolf Hitler in order to negotiate a peace agreement. It was September 1938, and Chamberlain, although perhaps naive, has been harshly judged by history. This quietly spoken British Prime Minister was 69 years old, an OAP by modern-day standards, when he flew to meet Hitler in Germany. Ironically, it was the first time that Chamberlain had ever flown in an aeroplane. Preparations were already in full swing in Britain for the onset of war. Plans to evacuate the children from London were being put into action, and the naval reserves had been called up. The people of Britain realised that they were on the verge of war, and Neville Chamberlain's peace initiative was viewed as the nation's last hope. When Chamberlain stepped from the plane back onto British soil, waving that famous piece of paper signed by himself, Daladier, the French Premier, Hitler and Mussolini, the waiting crowds cheered as war with Germany appeared to have been averted. Chamberlain was given a royal welcome at Buckingham Palace, and when he eventually returned to even bigger crowds at number 10 Downing Street, he uttered an immortal line that would prove to be rather premature. "I believe it is peace in our time. Go home and sleep quietly in your beds." However, not everybody was convinced by Mr. Chamberlain's optimism, and one of the most notable politicians to criticise this appeasement of Adolf Hitler was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was born in November 1874 at Blenheim Palace near Oxford, the son of the politician Lord Randolph Churchill, who was, in his turn, the third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. Winston's mother, Jenny, was an American, the daughter of a millionaire from New York. After a very traditional English education, boarding school followed by the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, young Winston was drawn to a career in politics, although he did see action in the Boer War as a war correspondent. Captured by the Boers, Winston made a dramatic escape into Mozambique, which certainly did great things for his reputation. When Churchill returned home, he stood for election to the Houses of Parliament in 1900. He won his Oldham seat by a slim majority, but it was nonetheless the beginning of a political career that would span 62 years. Never far from controversy, Churchill was first a Conservative, then a Liberal, and then a Conservative again. In 1911, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, But his involvement in planning the disastrous First World War campaign at Gallipoli, where 500,000 British and Allied servicemen lost their lives, earned him the title the Butcher of Gallipoli. It was an error of judgment that saw Churchill sidelined for a number of years. But by 1924, he returned to the Conservative Party to be appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer under Stanley Baldwin. Sadly for Churchill, the Conservative government was defeated in 1929, and again he found himself in the political wilderness. But as the 1930s dawned, Churchill voiced increased concerns about Adolf Hitler and his rise to power. Few listened as Churchill called for Britain to rearm, ready to face the threat of a Nazi offensive, especially when Chamberlain claimed to have averted war with Germany, confident that there would be peace in our time. Through the winter of 1938 and 39, there was a genuine hope in Britain that the spring would herald a peaceful and prosperous year. However, the rest of the world learnt a very frightening lesson on the 15th of March 1939. Adolf Hitler was not to be trusted. With no word of warning, the German army marched into Czechoslovakia, effectively destroying all hope of peace. Britain set about rearming, as Winston Churchill had always advocated, and the world watched and waited for Hitler's next move. Poland came under fierce pressure from Hitler to give up vast tracts of land that they'd acquired from Germany after World War I. Britain and France, in the hope of support from Russia, promised Poland protection, but Hitler was a step ahead. In August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with Russia, and on the 1st of September marched the German army into Poland. Britain and France sent ultimatums to Hitler. If he didn't withdraw from Polish soil by 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September, it would mean war. The people of Britain were very aware that war was imminent. But when a radio broadcast from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain at Downing Street brought the nation to a standstill at 11:15 on that fateful Sunday morning, the waiting was over. The Prime Minister, who had just a year previously brought the British people Hitler's signed promise of peace, announced that the nation was now at war with Germany. Within hours of the outbreak, a German U-boat claimed the first strike. The SS Athenia was torpedoed travelling between Belfast and Montreal. A number of the passengers were Americans, which gave the Germans an immediate problem, and their propaganda machine went straight into action. The USA had proclaimed neutrality as Britain and France declared war. But here the Germans had the perfect opportunity to placate the Americans and attack Churchill at the same time, declaring that a British submarine sent by Churchill had destroyed the Athenia. They believed that this would stop the Americans supplying essential goods to the United Kingdom. It was a preposterous story that would have been laughable in its ridiculousness had it not been indicative of the dangerous powers of propaganda that the Nazi war machine was capable of employing. After so much build-up and fearful trepidation, the people of Britain saw life return to relative normality, and the lull before the storm that was experienced through the autumn and winter of 1939 became known as the phony war. Many of the early civilian evacuees from London returned to the city, and apart from the distribution of gas masks, the introduction of a nightly blackout, and the conscription of young men between 20 and 22, a brooding, if menacing calm was restored. The same could not be said of events in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Germany and Russia carved up Poland between themselves, and Russia set its sights on war with Finland. Early in 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway, and although Denmark surrendered immediately, the Norwegians fought long and hard for their independence, but, like the Polish army before them, it was to no avail. It seemed as if nothing could stop Adolf Hitler in his bid to conquer the world. For modern-day psychologists, Hitler is one of the most fascinating historical case studies. But for the vast majority of people, he is the epitome of evil. Watching archive footage of Hitler addressing the crowds with his over-elaborate gestures and intense oration has an almost comical overtone. In point of fact, his resemblance to Charlie Chaplin may not have been completely coincidental. Chaplin was born just 4 days before Hitler in 1889, and when he put together his little tramp persona, he chose the moustache very carefully indeed. Chaplin was the master of silent comedy, and his face needed to show every emotion, unimpeded, so he elected for the little square accent on his upper lip that became as much Adolf Hitler's trademark as Chaplin's. Perhaps Hitler adopted the black moustache for the self-same reasons as Chaplin, to help convey his meaning to the huge crowds that came to his rallies, even if they couldn't hear what he was saying. But there was nothing funny about Hitler for the people of the world to laugh at when he came to power. His systematic destruction of Europe and his total disregard for human life was to put him in a class of madman all his own. Hitler was born in what was then Austria-Hungary, not far from the German border. His father was a customs official who was a strict disciplinarian, while his indulgent mother, who he adored, doted upon him. This provides plenty of material for DIY psychologists who will instantly spot an authoritarian personality mixed up with a classic Oedipus complex, traits that many mass murderers have exhibited, and that just for starters. However, by the age of 18, Hitler had lost both parents, and he moved to Vienna, hoping to find fame and fortune as an artist. There was a large Jewish community in Vienna, and anti-Semitic politicians there certainly influenced Hitler's views on the Jews. Rather than face military service in the Austro-Hungarian army, Hitler moved again, this time to Germany. But with the onset of World War I, he joined the Bavarian army and rapidly transformed into a fierce German patriot. Hitler's military record was exemplary. He was cited twice for bravery and even received the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918. Yet he was never promoted, and there were rumours that a medical examination revealed Adolf Hitler to be dangerously psychotic and incompetent to command people. After the German surrender in November 1918, Hitler remained in the army, but began leaning towards politics, joining with other like-minded nationalists looking for a scapegoat to be blamed for World War I, and more importantly, the German defeat, something that Hitler had never accepted. Unfortunately for the Jews, they fitted the bill perfectly, and by the 1920s, Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, were preaching anti-Semitism to the masses and planning to overthrow the German government. Hitler's first attempt to snatch power in 1923 resulted in him being convicted for high treason and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But as the authorities considered him to be relatively harmless, Adolf Hitler was given an amnesty and released in December 1924. However, he did manage to dictate an explosive little number, Mein Kampf, to Rudolf Hess, whilst he served his sentence. As Germany suffered an economic depression in the 1930s, Hitler, as party leader, and the Nazis seized the opportunity to really rise to power. Hitler's great oratory skills inspired the people of Germany to share his warped vision for their nation. Ironically, Hitler didn't become a German citizen until 1932, but by 1938 he'd pressured his Austrian homeland into unification with Germany. What is perhaps the most important lesson history has to teach here is the fact that Adolf Hitler was democratically voted into power after an albeit clever manipulation of German grievances after World War I. With the great gift of hindsight, it's very easy to brand Adolf Hitler a monster. But by the time the Germans began to realise just how dangerous he was, it was too late to stand against him, and it would take another world war to stop Hitler's ruthless, inhuman quest to quite literally reign supreme on a global scale. When Big Ben chimed to ring in the new year of 1940, it was an anxious time for the people of Britain, wondering what Hitler's next move would be. The first substantial change came with the introduction of rationing, as the government set about ensuring that everybody got their fair share of food and clothing. As an island nation, before the war started, Britain had imported much of what was needed, but the German U-boats disrupted supplies immediately at the outbreak of hostilities. At first, butter, sugar and bacon were rationed, quickly followed by meat, cheese, fresh eggs, jam, tea, breakfast cereals and milk. People were encouraged to dig up their gardens to grow as much food as possible and keep chickens, rabbits and goats. Ration books were issued, and each family had to register with a specific shop. Then the shopkeeper would be allocated only enough food to sell to the people on his list. Even the royal family at Buckingham Palace had a ration book, and as 1940 wore on, the British nation was forced to become self-sufficient with supplies from overseas effectively cut off. Yet the very waters that caused Britain's hardships at least afforded the country greater protection from Adolf Hitler than that for Belgium, Holland and France. Western Europe encountered the Blitzkrieg, which literally translates as lightning war, and with Germany's fast armoured tanks and superiority in the air, the outcome was devastating. On the 10th of May 1940, the people of Britain acquired a new Prime Minister as Winston Churchill took over from Neville Chamberlain to lead the country as head of an all-party government. It was the same day that Hitler's blitzkrieg of Germany's nearest neighbours began. The attack was swift and successful. By the end of May, Holland and Belgium had fallen, and just 2 weeks later the Germans marched into Paris as France also fell. Back in London, Winston Churchill needed all his inspirational genius to rally the nation and fire up the fighting spirit that had throughout history served Britain very well. In his first speech as Prime Minister, Churchill's declaration that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat set the tone perfectly. When the civilians of Britain, as well as the military personnel, were called upon to follow their leader's example with an immediate response, they rose to the challenge without exception. Winston Churchill described Dunkirk as a miracle of deliverance, as the British Expeditionary Force, alongside French troops, found themselves driven towards the sea by the advancing German army. All escape routes were cut off, and in excess of 330,000 men arrived at Dunkirk under continuous bomb and machine gun attack from German planes. The Admiralty sent destroyers and transport ships to evacuate as many men as possible, but they only expected to have time to save about 30,000 of the troops. What they encountered when they reached Dunkirk forced a complete rethink, as the harbour was blocked by sunken ships hit by German aircraft, and the troops needed to be rescued from the nearby beaches where the water was too shallow for the bigger ships to venture. There were 222 British naval vessels, but it was the flotilla of 665 smaller craft manned by brave civilians that really saved the day. They could get closer to the beaches so that the troops could wade out to them and either be ferried to the offshore naval vessels or, in some cases, all the way back to Britain. From tiny rowing boats to fancy yachts, tugs, motor launches, paddle steamers, fishing smacks, and even a London Fire Brigade river float. Some of the smaller craft made the hazardous crossings more than once, and between the 27th of May and the 3rd of June, 226,000 British and 110,000 French troops were transported back to the safety of the south coast of England. The RAF did a magnificent job of protecting the flotilla of ships, with open decks crowded with exhausted soldiers. All the way across the Channel they were bombarded by German Junker dive bombers, but the RAF counterattack ensured that they were unsuccessful. In fact, through the entire difficult and dangerous operation, just 6 destroyers were lost and 24 smaller boats, and of those, the civilian sailors simply transferred to other craft to continue helping with the evacuation. At a time when Britain was facing all the horrors of an imminent German invasion, the evacuation of Dunkirk captured the hearts and minds of the nation's people. Against all odds, over 1/3 troops were rescued to fight another day, and within a matter of weeks, the Battle of Britain was underway. But make no mistake, despite the valiant achievement of the evacuation of Dunkirk, the German star was in the ascendancy, and Britain stood alone. Continental Europe lay in the grip of Hitler's domination, and although the British Expeditionary Force had made it back home, the bulk of their burnt-out equipment and armaments littered northern France on the road to Dunkirk. For Adolf Hitler, conquering Britain must have seemed something of a formality, as he was beginning to believe that the German war machine was invincible. However, he was shrewd enough to know that the British Navy was stronger than his German counterpart, and an invasion by sea would not have been viable. Where the Germans were strong was in the air, and if the Luftwaffe could destroy the British Navy, the invasion could go ahead with the minimum of resistance. But between the Luftwaffe and the British Navy stood the RAF, and the Battle of Britain became the Battle of the Skies. On paper, the Royal Air Force lacked fighter pilots, but what they were missing in numbers, they certainly made up for in bravery and tenacity. They also had radar, a major invention by Scotsman James Watson Watt. Although not yet perfect, it gave the RAF a distinct advantage, and as well as targeting airfields, the Luftwaffe set their sights on the radar masts. Strategically, the Germans were on the right track. But just as they were poised to win the Battle of Britain, a German bomber being pursued by a British fighter pilot dropped its bomb load over London. Winston Churchill immediately retaliated with bombing raids on German cities. Hitler was enraged and directed the Luftwaffe to switch targets from the airfields to the capital. It was the respite that the RAF needed, and although London suffered horrendous damage, for the first time since the invasion of Poland, Hitler failed to achieve a military goal. The RAF, although damaged, was not destroyed, and Germany lost the opportunity to invade Britain, as by September 1940, the weather and autumnal tide patterns made such a move impractical. Changing tactics, Hitler turned his attention to the east, looking towards new conquests on the Russian front. But Britain was by no means off the hook. The invasion threat was certainly minimised, but Hitler accelerated the German bombings of British cities, London in particular, in an attempt to destroy the nation's morale. This bombardment is more commonly known as the Blitz, and for the civilians of Britain, it was both their finest and their darkest hour. The Luftwaffe's nightly bombing raids hit London very hard, but people soon became accustomed to the nightly ritual of heading for their air raid shelters or sleeping in London's underground stations. Each morning, people emerged to inspect the damage. There was no distinction for the bombers between rich and poor. The terrace slums of the East End were hit, as was the grand architecture of Buckingham Palace. By Christmas 1940, the German bombers had decimated the city of Coventry, and Plymouth, Birmingham, Southampton, Bristol, Manchester, Sheffield, Portsmouth and Leicester had all suffered direct hits. There was an all too brief respite from the bombing over the Christmas holiday, but with rationing in force, the celebrations were already low-key, with survival being everybody's main concern. Yet the wartime spirit that was emerging took the people of Britain into the new year of 1941, making the best of whatever came their way. The losses had been devastating by the time the Blitz was scaled down in May, when Hitler attacked Russia, tying up 2/3 of the German military on the Eastern Front. 43,000 people had been killed across Great Britain, and 1.4 million had been made homeless. For Hitler and his comrades in arms, 1941 would prove to be a very telling year. The Italian dictator Mussolini's armies in Greece and Tobruk were defeated, and Germany stormed into North Africa before invading Greece and Yugoslavia. On the Russian front, Hitler advanced swiftly through the summer months, but the Germans were crippled by the freezing Soviet winter, and progress stagnated for the rest of the year. Then on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese changed the course of the war with a surprise attack on the US Navy base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Global conflict was now unavoidable. Germany declared war on America, and Japan invaded the Philippines, Burma, and Hong Kong. It was war in the Pacific, and the horrors of the Japanese prisoner of war camps equaled the growing inhumanity in the German concentration camps. Despite increased hardships, Christmas 1941 became a time of hope for the people of Britain. Clothing was now rationed as well as food, but the British people were no longer standing alone in their fight against Hitler. In January 1942, the first of the American GIs arrived, and although some of the British natives were restless, complaining that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here, but generally speaking, they brought an air of optimism to the beleaguered people of Britain. On a larger scale, the American government was able to manufacture and supply replacement vehicles and munitions for those lost in northern France before the mass exodus at Dunkirk. The bombing raids on British cities continued, as did the reciprocal bombings of German cities. Singapore fell to the Japanese, but the British took the initiative in North Africa under the inspired command of Field Marshal Montgomery, and the Russians counterattacked on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. Winston Churchill worked closely with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, and the British Prime Minister's eloquent speeches continued to inspire the nation. Lines like, "We shall fight them on the beaches." Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And, of course, "We shall never surrender," made him a force to be reckoned with as he raised morale and helped the British people to focus on the task ahead of them. Towards the end of 1942, news reached the rest of the world telling of the horrors of the German concentration camps and the mass murder of the Jews. This strengthened the Allies' resolve, and the USA immediately pledged to avenge these crimes against humanity. The tide was definitely turning against Hitler, and in February 1943, the Germans surrendered at Stalingrad. The battle for the Atlantic still raged as the German U-boats continued to sink Allied shipping with devastating accuracy. However, the unsung heroes in the fight against the deadly U-boats were the code breakers at Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, who deciphered the Enigma code to be able to predict where the U-boats were about to strike. The work at Bletchley was top secret, which is why the tales of tenacity, ingenuity, and sheer genius have only come to light in more recent years. The people of Britain truly were pulling together in all walks of life, and the fact that the work of the codebreakers stayed secret is testament to how seriously everyone took their responsibilities. By the end of 1943, the Allies made progress in Italy, but the fight was slow and costly. It took until the 5th of June 1944 for Rome to be liberated, but the following day, the military operation codenamed Overlord was to mark the beginning of the end of the war. This was D-Day. For months, the south coast of Britain had been transformed into a virtual army camp, with 3.5 million soldiers, sailors and airmen, all in training to liberate Europe. American troops, weapons and vehicles were shipped across the Atlantic to Britain, and they were joined by the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders and other Allied forces from all over the world. Hitler was expecting an Allied invasion force, but the Germans believed that it would come from Kent to Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Also, in the June of 1944, the weather was atrocious, and even the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had to postpone the invasion on the 5th of June as a result. It was a tough call. The weather was still dreadful on the 6th of June, but the go-ahead was given, and the destination was the Normandy beaches of France. Miraculously, the whole operation took the Germans completely by surprise. 6,500 vessels transported 130,000 troops across the Channel without alerting the Germans. The RAF kept the skies above clear with such legendary planes as the Spitfires and Lancaster bombers, and they also attacked German strongholds along the coast of Normandy from the air. Of the 5 beaches, code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword, the biggest casualties were suffered by the Americans on Omaha Beach, where the German resistance was strongest. Yet, despite the success of the D-Day landings, the battle to liberate France was hard fought, and it took until August for the Allies to achieve their task and march into Paris. The Germans were under fire on all sides as the Russians drove ever westwards, liberating the concentration camp at Auschwitz early in 1945. The race was on for Berlin. Would the Western Allies or the Russians get to Berlin first? On the 21st of April, the Russians arrived in Berlin, with the rest of the Allies quickly following. For Hitler, there was nowhere left to run, and in his Berlin bunker he took his own life on the 30th of April. The very next day, the man he'd nominated as the new president of Germany, Goebbels, also committed suicide, as did his wife and young children. The war in Europe was effectively over, and the Allies agreed to make Victory in Europe VE Day on the 9th of May 1945. But the news of Germany's surrender broke prematurely, and the people of Britain celebrated VE Day in grand style on the 8th of May. A carnival mood swept the length and breadth of the country, but in London it was as if the entire population had flooded out onto the streets to celebrate peace in their time at last. Trafalgar Square and the Mall, all the way up to Buckingham Palace, was packed with cheering crowds, as King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, along with Winston Churchill, came out onto the palace balcony to wave to the people. American President Roosevelt sadly died in April 1945 without seeing the end of the war, And for the Americans and Allied troops still fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, the war still had some months to run. Harry S. Truman, America's new president, had a monumentous decision to make within months of taking power. Although the Allies were prepared for an invasion of Japan to finish the war, there would have been fierce resistance and massive casualties. Since 1942, the Allied scientists had been developing the atomic bomb, and it was by this time available to Truman as an option. The scale of devastation would be unprecedented, but the war would be over with the minimum of casualties for the American and Allied forces. On the 6th of August 1945, Truman sanctioned the dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Just 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And on the 14th of August, the Japanese surrendered, which is still commemorated in the USA as Victory over Japan, or VJ Day. This was the end of the biggest conflict in history. Over 50 million people were killed, of which 15 million were military personnel, 20 million were Russian civilians, and more than 6 million were Jews. How the world would recover from the legacy of Adolf Hitler's evil regime would shape the remainder of the 20th century. And for the people of Britain, the long journey back to peace, normality and prosperity would be as hard-fought as the war years had been. The social implications of the war were extremely significant. Returning British servicemen were not prepared to accept unemployment, and having been responsible for securing the safety of the nation, they were determined to have their say in post-war reconstruction. Despite the vital role Winston Churchill played as Britain's wartime Prime Minister, it was time for a change, and after the general election of 1945, he found himself on the opposition benches. The new Labour government, under the leadership of Clement Attlee, was voted into power with a huge majority. In the early war years, economist William Beveridge had proposed a cradle-to-grave social security plan, and the Labour Party were now in a position to put the socially reforming measures into place. Family allowances were actually awarded before the end of the war, and free school lunches for poorer children were made available from 1946. However, the most important change came with the introduction of a National Health Service in 1948, which provided medical treatment for all, free of charge, at the point of delivery. It was the beginning of the welfare state in Britain, and a fitting reward for all those who'd given so much for their country through the war years. As well as nationalising the hospitals, the Labour government also nationalised the Bank of England, the coal industry, electricity, gas, air transport, road, rail and waterway travel. Central control of the economy was to prove as important in peacetime as it had during war. Family life in Britain after the war was precious, but at the same time precarious. The women had been used to taking a very proactive role, working in the munitions factories, the services, the WRVS, or the Land Army, as well as caring for and, most importantly, feeding their children. Returning to the role of housewife was not necessarily an easy transition, particularly after so much freedom. The problem was equally difficult for the returning men, settling back down to domestic routine after the adrenaline rush of war. Many had been away for 5 years or more, and their children didn't even recognise them, making these men in effect complete strangers in their own homes. Consequently, it was not always happy ever after, even for those families not torn apart by the casualties of war. It often comes as a surprise that rationing in Britain didn't end with the war, and shortages were in fact even worse in the immediate aftermath. Bread rationing didn't actually begin until June 1946, although it did end just a month later. The process of de-rationing began in 1948, with flour, followed by clothing in 1949. In May 1950, canned and dried fruit, chocolate biscuits, treacle, syrup, jellies and mincemeat all became available without coupons. Petrol also came off ration, as did soap. It took a further 3 years for sugar and butter to come off ration, and then finally, on the 4th of July 1954, restrictions on meat and bacon were lifted. The war on the kitchen front, as it was described, was over. Although many older people who lived through the years of rationing in their youth have never been able to shake off the waste not, want not philosophy. However, in our modern-day society, with increasing health problems due to obesity and a diet and binge culture, there's much to be said in favour of Britain's wartime food consumption, and a nation that was basically fitter and healthier than many people can ever hope to be in the 21st century. The royal family that had provided such a beacon of hope throughout the war years still delighted a country emerging from the trauma of conflict. In 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip of Greece in Westminster Abbey. With all the glamour of a royal wedding, the people of Britain rejoiced and once more filled the streets of London in celebration. The royal family were again at the forefront of the Festival of Britain celebrations in 1951, held to stimulate trade after the war, with King George VI taking an active involvement in the project to help Britain move forward from austerity to a bright new future. It was the year that Winston Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister at the grand old age of 77. Just a year later, he was to prove of great comfort to Princess Elizabeth, when in 1952, her father, George VI, died at the age of 56. It truly was the beginning of a new era, as the nation once more flocked to the streets, firstly to bid a fond farewell at Windsor to the king that had led them through the war years, and secondly to witness the coronation of his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, in Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June 1953. Elizabeth, at 25 years of age, epitomised the hope of peacetime Britain, and with her young family encouraged a new vision for the future. We started this programme with the words of William Shakespeare extolling the virtues of an island nation and the resolve of a people that refuses to relinquish freedom to tyranny. World War II cast a long dark shadow over Great Britain, but against seemingly insurmountable odds, a spirit of resistance truly did bring out the very best attributes the country had to offer. Over the passage of time since, the world and Britain has changed almost beyond recognition. The spirit of camaraderie that truly ensured that peace was won, although no longer evident on a day-to-day basis, will never be forgotten as a chapter in world history that brought out the very best of British at a time when the very worst excesses of inhumanity were gathering all around. There was never any need, as Churchill skillfully put it, to fight on the beaches. But one thing's absolutely for certain. A people proud to gaze out to sea from every possible point of the compass would have defended Shakespeare's sceptred isle to the last, with the spirit that any potential invaders of the future would do well to remember and never underestimate.